Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 33 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Arizona Coyotes, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. And it was a couple of days ago where the Sharks faced off against the Los Angeles Kings, and they lost that one by a score of 4-1. And I talked about how it wasn't super disappointing to see them lose that because the Sharks were just so much worse of a team than Los Angeles, who were one of the best in the Pacific Division, if not one of the best in the entire league. This game tonight against the Arizona Coyotes is much more a team their speed. Of course, the Coyotes do find themselves now in a playoff spot, but ever since the terrible start to the season that the San Jose Sharks have, as of late, they've been playing like not necessarily a playoff team, for sure not, but a couple of steps below that, one of those bubble teams that finishes like 10th last in the league or something along those lines. So it was bound to be a slightly more competitive game here tonight, and it was. The San Jose Sharks actually put up a pretty strong performance, but unfortunately for themselves, the big difference maker is that the Sharks got their chances and couldn't score on them, while the Coyotes got their chances and did score on them. Sometimes when it comes to two teams who are competitive and very close to each other in terms of skill level, that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. And so this one starts off in the first period, and the Sharks are actually playing rather well. Their first period, I would say, was better than what the Coyotes put up, but unfortunately there is no goals for them to show for it, and as such it is a 0-0 game at the end of the first 20 minutes. In the second period, things definitely begin to break down. Most of these Coyotes goals were ones that were quite preventable from San Jose, but mistakes in terms of defensive positioning, in terms of effort, in terms of back checking, plagued the Sharks here tonight and caused them to give up all 5 of these goals, none of them actually being on an empty net situation, the first of which going to Kesselring, as the Sharks just zero effort on the back check in this situation, zero effort in being able to cover this defenseman pinching down to make it 1-0 Arizona. The Sharks would tie the game up with a goal from Anthony Duclair, as usual, coming from on a breakaway for himself, before the Coyotes would get one back from Keller on his own breakaway, and then 3-1 Arizona by the end of the second period. The third period would immediately start with a San Jose Sharks goal coming from Filip Zadina, a bit of a weird one that he kind of tips it, he pokes at it, and it sort of floats over the goaltender's shoulder or arm or what have you to bring this game to within 1. But the Sharks' third period wasn't great, as they were playing extremely sloppy, especially after that goal was scored, and this allowed the Coyotes to not only make it 4-2 but then 5-2 as well. And unlike in the previous couple of games where David Quinn was willing to pull the goaltender with a couple of minutes left, even though they were down by 3 goals, that was not necessarily the case here tonight. Instead, it is Blackwood who stays put in the net, and as such the Sharks just sort of go down quietly with the 5-2 loss. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Eklund and Hertl being joined by Zadina. This is because Barabanov was a scratch here for tonight. So coming into this game, it seemed as though, since he was not going to be in the lineup, that this was going to be a very much deserved healthy scratch, similar to what we saw Duclair get a couple of games ago. Instead, it seems the news at the end of this game is that Barabanov was actually ill, was sick for tonight's game, and unfortunately for that reason could not dress. However, it's kind of a situation where obviously I don't think David Quinn is lying, but when he heard that Barabanov was ill, he probably wasn't super disappointed in that news, because Barabanov absolutely could use the game on the sidelines to watch from the press box, because he has not been particularly impressive at all since his return from injury a few weeks ago. And so Eklund and Hertl are instead joined by Zadina, who over these past couple of games has been working quite hard on the fourth line, has been showing a certain level of skill and a certain level of speed, but without any actual finish, partly due to the fact that he's not exactly playing with the best of line mates when he's on that fourth line, but also partly due to the fact that he individually is struggling to actually finish on his own plays. And so when thrusted into a situation playing with 2 of the Sharks' best forwards on the team, it definitely works to Zadina's benefit, as finally his speed was able to be complemented by the skill of these 2 other players. So Zadina, perhaps one of, if not his best night as a San Jose Shark, which is definitely not really saying much, considering Zadina hasn't really had much more than a small handful of actually good games here with the Sharks, but it was nice to see him actually perform here. Zadina hasn't really been back up on this top line since the early parts of the season when he was playing with Tomas Hertl, and so that was good to see. When it comes to both Hertl and Eklund, they both had some very strong offensive zone shifts, not on a super consistent basis. It felt as though there were one too many shifts here tonight where this line didn't exactly do much, but when they actually got working in the offensive zone, they were tough to deal with. They were hard to push off the puck. They managed to generate the one goal, which was from Zadina, which was nice to see. Likely would have liked to be able to get a couple of more for themselves. Eklund came pretty close. Zadina came very close, especially in the third period, to a second goal there. And generally, I would say it was a positive game for the first line. It's certainly going to be interesting to see whether, if Barabanov is healthy enough to play for the game on Saturday, if he draws back in the lineup, and if so, does he immediately take his first line spot back, or will he end up getting dropped to the third line in favor of Zadina, because this was definitely a performance worthy enough of getting another look in this position. When it comes to the second line, we have Zetterlund, Granlund, and Duclair, and I would like to start with Duclair, because as I mentioned, it was a couple of games ago where he was a healthy scratch. David Quinn saying that the effort was just not consistent there. And the one thing that you can't really say about Duclair is that you can't say that he's not generating chances. He had obviously this breakaway in this game. He had a very close call right in front of the net as well, I believe in the third period or perhaps late in the second period, which was just inches from being able to go into the net. But the thing that you really notice about Duclair is that he doesn't necessarily seem like the hardest working forward on the ice. I know obviously that's a bit unfair to say about him, because perhaps maybe it's just his style of play or something along those lines, but you look at some of the other players on this team like Hertl and Eklund and Zetterlund, and in particular just his two line mates Zetterlund and Granlund, Duclair always seems to be slightly more coasting, I would say, and that could be very well a reason for why David Quinn indeed felt the need to healthy scratch him, and I don't necessarily think that has fully corrected itself over these last couple of games that he's been back in the lineup. So it's nice to see the goal scoring there, and it's nice to see some chances being generated, but I just wish we could see a more consistent 60-minute effort from Duclair, even if it doesn't come with the goal scoring necessarily. When we come to the other two players on this line, I thought this was perhaps Zetterlund's one of his better games of the last few. It felt as though he was kind of lagging behind a bit at times over these past few games. Not necessarily bad, but just not as great as he was maybe a couple of weeks ago. But it was a very solid game for himself, a great defensive play that led to the Duclair breakaway in this one that was that goal. A couple of other really good looks for himself. So I definitely like Zetterlund. He was perhaps the best forward on this second line, because Granlund, for a second straight game, didn't necessarily make as much of an impact as you would have liked to see. It has been a bit of a return to earth for Granlund over these past couple of games after he was really high flying with the points at every which direction here. Again, a game in which he does not register a point here tonight, and so it was not a bad game for Granlund, but maybe defensively for this line as a whole, it wasn't amazing. And while they did have a couple of good shifts, nothing super consistent, and Granlund, considering he is the main sort of playmaker, the main play driver on this line, that was certainly in a way on him. When it comes to this third line, we have Hoffman, Cunnin, and Justin Bailey. Not a super effective line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Once again, for the second straight game, I will commend Hoffman, who I think is certainly doing his best to try and get this third line on the board, to try and get them some chances. But Cunnin has been more so invisible and honestly kind of a liability for the San Jose Sharks at time. And while Justin Bailey continues to show off a very nice speed to his game, his decision-making here tonight certainly wasn't really on point. A few really bad giveaways at times in this one, a couple of bad reads as well. And so at the end of the day, this third line didn't get to do much, even if Hoffman was trying his best, because the other two players, not so great. And then we get to the fourth line. The first thing to mention, of course, is that Giovanni Smith in the lineup here tonight, but gets injured about a few minutes into this game, a period or so into this game, so he bows out. The Sharks then have, of course, the classic rotating fourth line, joined with Labanc and Studnicka, and I do want to talk about Studnicka because it feels as though, while it's still very early on, he's only played a couple of games, it's a bit of a failed experiment by Mike Grier at this point, and the Sharks didn't lose a ton of value, just Nick Cicek and a 6th round pick, but when you give up the extra asset, you are hoping to get at least something interesting back. But Studnicka very much feels as though the type of player who, once the Sharks actually get a bit healthier, once Barabanov returns, once Carpenter returns, and all of these players, that Studnicka really should just be that odd man out, especially once Nico Sturm returns as well, because he has done pretty much nothing to impress, and he probably had like the worst play we've seen from a Sharks player in a while, with his weird back pass in the neutral zone looking for Duclair that just ends up being a straight pass into the offensive zone where the Coyotes don't even have to tag up because it is the Sharks themselves pushing them back in the offensive zone. It was just an extremely odd play. I don't really know the decision making for it, but not a very good look for Studnicka, who has not been good for the San Jose Sharks in the few games he has played. And then when it comes to Kevin Labanc, I don't think he was great here tonight, but not exactly a lot of help to help him out in that situation, to help him actually do much of anything on the scoreboard. So it's hard to fault him too much, and he should be able to have at least a bit of leeway to be able to keep his spot in the lineup, at least for the next game prior to the holiday break. Moving on to the defensemen, we have Ferraro and Burrows. Now, the good news for these two players is that they actually performed quite well from an offensive standpoint. I'm interested in, when it comes to Mario Ferraro, with the trade rumors that are pretty heavily circling this player. He may very well get moved near or at the trade deadline in a couple of months from now. Maybe he's trying to sort of index into that offensive play style to show him as more of a well-rounded player, because he was actually jumping up into the play quite aggressively here tonight, and it was actually working quite well in a few of these shifts, which was nice to see. This did backfire a bit in the case that he ended up staying out on the ice for some extended shifts, and then in the defensive zone exceptionally tired and unable to really defend particularly well at that point. And just generally, his defensive game, like with Burrows here tonight, wasn't great, but it was interesting to see for sure that that offensive output was indeed there from both of these players. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Jan Ruda and Henry Thrun. So we saw Thrun and Ahutyuk get paired together last game, and that was pretty much a disaster for San Jose. Luckily for them, Ruda does return from his illness, and so they're able to separate Ahutyuk and Thrun, and I thought that was a very good thing, at the very least for Thrun, who looked significantly more secure here tonight. He didn't do much, as honestly his offensive jumps were not nearly as apparent as they have been in the past few games, but on the other side of thing, and probably in a more positive way, as it ends up being one of his best games since being called up recently, is that he was not just giving the puck away like they are Halloween candy on the 31st of October. He was more steady, which was definitely nice to see. Jan Ruda, kind of in a similar vein, pretty steady game for him. It's not as though these two players were particularly great, but I thought they did okay enough. You could certainly argue when it comes to Henry Thrun that he could have done a better job of tying up Kerfoot in front of the net, which was the goal that made it 3-1 for the Coyotes. But this is not necessarily a case where Kerfoot actually gets his stick on the puck, where you're saying, oh, he should have tied up his stick. He actually did tie up his stick. The problem was he didn't exactly have the body position in this situation, which allowed Kerfoot to kind of angle his skate in such a way that it would deflect the puck into the net. So criticism is there for Thrun, but maybe not as heavy as for other players in other situations. And then finally, we have the bottom pairing for San Jose, McDonald and Ahutyuk. Now, when it comes to Jacob McDonald, his defensive game is never going to be great. This is perhaps why the Sharks so frequently decide to run him as a forward for this season and near the end of last season. At the moment, they're kind of just forced to have him on the back end because Vlasic isn't a good option and a bunch of other defensemen are injured, and this is not something to last. But at the very least, from an offensive standpoint, he is quite good in that area. I mean, quite good is maybe perhaps an overstatement, but he's really not all that bad. In fact, if you compare it to the other offensive defenseman on the San Jose Sharks, a player who was brought in a trade to be an offensive guy, Kalen Addison, Jacob MacDonald showed more in this game than we had seen from Addison like 5 games prior to the game where he actually ended up getting injured. So that was quite nice to see. I like that he has a bit of a rocket from the point, which is quite cool to watch. His power play on the second unit is actually not all that bad, and so generally from an offensive standpoint, he does things pretty well. And he was paired with Okhotiuk here tonight, and it's just Okhotiuk has played a large chunk of games for the San Jose Sharks this season, and pretty much in every single one of them, I have always pointed out some flaws in Okhotiuk's game. At this point, I just kind of sound like a broken record, constantly talking about the bad decisions and giveaways that he always makes. At this point, it just seems to be a case of where me and David Quinn are going to agree to disagree. David Quinn clearly likes him as a player, though of course he doesn't have that many better options like I already talked about with MacDonald, and I clearly don't like him as much as a player, and he's going to continue to get a lineup spot, it seems, anyway. And then finally, when it comes to the goaltender, we have Mackenzie Blackwood, who definitely had a bit of an off night here. A couple of these goals he absolutely could have had. The Kesselring one wasn't necessarily all that tough to stop. The Krause one wasn't particularly difficult to stop. And so while a couple of these didn't have a chance on, like the Kerfoot one or the Schmaltz one, this was a game that could have been much closer with a bit better goaltenders or a bit better goaltending. And so I imagine for the final game for the San Jose Sharks, as that will do it for this review, the Sharks will be back in action on Saturday against the Vancouver Canucks. I imagine we will see Kaapo Kähkönen get that final start prior to the holiday break, as the Sharks take on the Vancouver Canucks for the 4th and final time already this season. We're not even halfway through the year, and they're already playing the Canucks the entire season series. The Sharks got crushed in the first couple of games, one of them being a 10-1 loss, but actually won their third matchup, and so we'll see if they can either equalize it or go down 1-3. Class dismissed.